Picture this. You are standing at the stern of a ship. The wood beneath your boots is wet, not from rain, not from waves, but from something older, something that has soaked into the grain of every plank, every beam, every bolt of iron on this vessel. The year could be 1680, or 1780, or last night. Because on this ship, time does not move the way it does on land. You are aboard the Flying Dutchman, the most famous ghost ship in maritime history, a vessel that no port has logged, no navy has captured, no lighthouse has ever guided to safety. Sailors across 4 centuries have claimed to see her on the horizon masts, rising out of fog banks that had no business being there, lanterns burning in weather that should have extinguished every flame on the ocean. And almost every one of those accounts says the same thing. She was moving against the wind. Now, most people who have heard of the Flying Dutchman know the broad strokes. Cursed captain, eternal voyage, the ship that can never make port. It has been turned into operas, novels, films, legends, layered on top of legends, until the original story is almost impossible to find underneath all the mythology. But here is what almost nobody talks about: the cabin. Because here is the thing about ships, and this is true whether we are talking about a 17th century Dutch merchantman or a modern aircraft carrier. The captain's cabin is not just a room. It is a nerve center. It is the place where every critical decision gets made, where every important document gets stored, where the captain keeps whatever he cannot afford to lose. The cabin is a window into who the captain actually was. And if the Flying Dutchman is real, if Hendrik van der Decken is real, then what is inside his cabin is the most important inventory in maritime history, because it has been accumulating for 340 years without anyone ever adding to it or taking anything away. Today, we open the door. What you are about to hear is not legend. It is not myth dressed up as history. It is what the historical record, the folklore record, the archaeological record, and the navigational record of the 17th century Atlantic actually tell us about who van der Decken was, what kind of ship he commanded, what kind of man chose to sail her, and what he would have kept in that cabin. And by the time we are done, the story you thought you knew will look like a child's drawing next to a nautical chart. Stay with me. Before we can understand what is in the cabin, we need to understand who put it there. The name Hendrik van der Decken first appears in the historical record in a version of the legend documented in the early 18th century, though the story almost certainly predates that by several decades. The name itself is Dutch, van der Decken. It translates roughly as of the deck, which is either a remarkable coincidence or a detail that someone in the storytelling chain added deliberately because they understood what a ship's deck meant to a captain who could never leave it. What we know about the historical template for van der Decken, the real man, or men, whose stories got folded into the legend, is this. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the largest commercial enterprise in the history of the world up to that point. At its peak in the mid-17th century, it had more than 150 merchant ships at sea simultaneously. It employed roughly 50,000 people. It had its own army, its own navy, its own judicial system, its own prisons. It was not just a trading company. It was a sovereign entity that happened to move goods across oceans. And the men who captained its ships were not simple sailors. They were executives. They were diplomats. They were military commanders. A VOC captain in the 1650s or 1680s was responsible for cargo worth the equivalent of millions of modern dollars, for a crew of sometimes over 200 men, and for navigating one of the most treacherous sea routes in the world. The route from Amsterdam to Batavia, modern Jakarta, required rounding the Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost tip of Africa, a place so consistently brutal in terms of weather that sailors had been giving it names that reflected genuine terror for over a century before van der Decken supposedly tried to round it. The Cape of Storms, the Cape of Needles, the place where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans collide in a permanent argument that generates some of the highest waves ever recorded anywhere on Earth. Winds from the Southern Ocean, currents running in opposite directions on either side of the peninsula, fog so thick you could lose the bow of your own ship from the stern. Rocks that had claimed dozens of vessels before anyone had a reliable chart of them. This is the place where Hendrik van der Decken allegedly made his mistake, or his choice, depending on which version of the legend you believe. The standard account goes like this. Van der Decken was rounding the Cape in severe weather. The prudent decision, the decision every other captain in similar conditions had made, was to turn back, wait for the weather to break, try again. Van der Decken refused. He declared that he would round the Cape if it took until Judgment Day. He cursed God. He may have physically thrown the chaplain overboard, and in response, God or the devil, depending on the version, condemned him to sail the waters around the Cape forever, never making port, never finding rest. What the legend does not tell you is what that story actually meant to the sailors who first told it. Because in the 17th century maritime world, turning back was not cowardice, it was calculation. A captain who turned back in bad weather was making a judgment call about risk versus reward. The VOC had protocols. If the weather made rounding the Cape impossible or unreasonably dangerous, you turned back. You lost time, you lost money. But you did not lose the ship, the cargo, or the 200 men whose lives were in your hands. A captain who refused to turn back in conditions that warranted it was not brave. He was reckless. He was putting his own pride, his own schedule, his own commercial interests ahead of the most basic obligations of command. And that is the real horror underneath the ghost story. Van der Decken was not cursed by God for defying the weather. He was cursed by his own character. The thing that condemned him to sail forever was the same thing that made him dangerous to his crew in the first place. He could not stop. He could not admit that the ocean was stronger than his will. And so he kept going, and going, and going. The Flying Dutchman is not a story about divine punishment. It is a story about what happens when a man's ego becomes indistinguishable from his compass. Now, let us go inside his cabin and see what that man kept close to him. To understand the cabin, you have to understand the ship. The Flying Dutchman, in the version of the legend that has the most historical texture, was a VOC flight. A flight was a specific type of Dutch merchant vessel developed in the late 16th century that became the dominant cargo ship in the North Sea and Atlantic trade for the better part of 100 years. And the design choices that went into the flight tell you something important about who was building it and why. The hull was wide in the middle and narrow at the top. This was not aesthetic. Dutch ports taxed ships based on the width of their upper deck, so Dutch shipbuilders designed a vessel that was massive in the cargo hold where the money was and narrow at the top deck where the tax assessors measured. The flight was essentially a piece of legal engineering disguised as naval architecture. The result was a ship that could carry an enormous amount of cargo with a relatively small crew. Where other nations' merchant ships needed large crews, partly for self-defense, the flight ran lean. It was fast for its size. It was efficient. It was exactly what a company that was moving huge volumes of goods across long distances needed. But efficiency came at a cost. The Flyet was not a fighting ship. It had minimal armament by the standards of the era, which meant that on the Cape route, a route frequented by pirates, privateers, and the naval vessels of competing European powers, a flight captain needed to be something more than a navigator. He needed to be a strategist. He needed to understand threat assessment, route selection, timing, and the complex political geography of colonial ports where alliances shifted faster than winds. Van der Decken's cabin on a vessel like this would have been located at the stern in the aft castle structure. This was universal across vessel types in the period. The stern was the most stable part of the ship. It was also the most defensible. In a boarding action, the captain's cabin was the last redoubt. You could control the ship from there, even if the rest of the deck was lost. And on a ship that was not built for fighting, you wanted your most critical assets, your charts, your instruments, your logbooks, your captain, as protected as possible. The cabin itself would have been small by any modern standard, perhaps 4 meters by 3, low ceiling. Windows at the stern windows on a Dutch flight were often glazed, which was a luxury that even many wealthy households on land could not afford. A bunk built into the bulkhead, a writing table, a chest for personal effects, a rack for weapons, hooks for a lantern. Everything in that room was chosen deliberately. Space on a ship is the most expensive real estate in the world. Every cubic meter of cabin space was a cubic meter that was not earning the VOC money. So what Decken chose to keep in that cabin, what he chose to prioritize over cargo revenue, tells you exactly what he considered essential. Let us go through it. The first thing you would notice, entering Decken's cabin, is the logbook. Not because it is large. It is not. A ship's log in the 17th century was typically a simple bound journal, perhaps 30 centimeters by 20, covered in whatever leather was cheapest and most water-resistant. But it would be on the table. It would be open, because a captain's log was not a historical document. It was a working instrument. It was being written in constantly, updated at every watch, recording position, weather, sea state, crew health, cargo condition, incidents, sightings, decisions. The log was the legal and commercial record of the voyage. If something went wrong, if cargo was lost, if crew members died, if the ship deviated from its authorized route, the log was the document that the VOC would examine when the captain returned to Amsterdam. It was his account of events, his justification for every decision he made at sea. Which means that a captain who was reckless, who pushed his ship and crew beyond safe limits, who made decisions driven by pride rather than prudence, would have a very interesting relationship with his logbook, because every entry was simultaneously a record and a defense. Now, the legend of the Flying Dutchman adds a dimension to the logbook that the real VOC version did not have. In the folklore, Decken's log has been running for 300 years. The last entry made on the night he cursed God and refused to turn back is still there. Ink that has not dried in 3 centuries, pages that are perpetually damp. And here is why that detail resonates even outside the supernatural frame. The VOC kept meticulous records. The company archives what survived are now held in archives across the Netherlands, South Africa, and Indonesia. And they represent one of the largest bodies of pre-modern commercial documentation in the world. Researchers have been working through them for decades. And what they reveal is a world of extraordinary complexity, trade networks that spanned 3 oceans, political relationships that made the European diplomatic maps of the period look simple, corruption, ingenuity, brutality, and occasional brilliance, all layered on top of each other in ledgers and letters and logbooks. Decken's log, if it existed, would be part of that archive. The record of a man who took his ship to the edge of the world and found something there that no log entry could adequately describe. What did he write on that last night? What words does a man put in his log when he has decided to stop obeying the rules that govern his world? When he has looked at the weather and the charts and the tide tables and decided that none of them apply to him anymore? The legend does not tell us. The legend only tells us that he wrote something, and that whatever it was the last thing he ever wrote as a man who was still part of the human world. After that, he became something else. The second category of objects in Decken's cabin is the navigation equipment, and this is where the historical and the legendary converge in a way that is genuinely unsettling if you think it through carefully. Navigation in the 17th century was not what most people imagine it to be. It was not simply a matter of following a compass. Compass navigation, dead reckoning, had been the primary method for centuries, but it had severe limitations. You could track your heading and your speed and estimate your position, but errors accumulated. Small mistakes in speed estimation, small deviations in course, built up over a long voyage until you might be 50 or 100 miles from where you thought you were. On an open ocean, that was survivable. Near a coast, near rocks, near shoals, it was fatal. The alternative was celestial navigation, using the position of the sun and stars to calculate your actual latitude and longitude. And this required instruments, a Davis quadrant, or later a sextant, to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon at noon, an astrolabe, or a cross staff, for star sights, an accurate timepiece, or a set of lunar distance tables to calculate longitude, arithmetic, logarithm tables, the mathematical knowledge to use all of it correctly. A VOC captain was required to be a navigator. The company tested its officers. certified them. A man who could not demonstrate competence in celestial navigation did not get a command. Van der Decken, whatever else he was a certified Vok navigator. He had passed those tests. He had the instruments. He had the knowledge. And here is where the legend becomes interesting, because the Flying Dutchman is described in nearly every sighting account from the 18th and 19th centuries as moving with purpose. Not drifting, not wandering aimlessly, moving against the wind, moving in specific directions, making for specific waters. A ghost ship that navigates, which means that whatever happened to Van der Decken on that night at the Cape, whatever curse was laid on him or whatever choice he made, he kept navigating. He kept using the instruments. He kept reading the sky and the charts and the currents. The navigation table in his cabin, and there would absolutely have been a navigation table, bolted to the deck to keep it stable in heavy weather, would have his instruments on it. The quadrant, the compass, the logarithm tables, the charts, and the charts. Let us talk about the charts for a moment, because this is where the historical reality of the 17th century gets genuinely interesting. Sea charts in Van der Decken's era were state secrets, not metaphorically. Literally, the Portuguese had built their empire on the back of navigational knowledge that they guarded with the full authority of the crown. The Dutch, when they broke into the Eastern trade in the late 16th century, did it partly by stealing Portuguese charts. The Vok then guarded its own charts with equal jealousy. Charts were classified documents, accurate charts of the Cape route, of the Indian Ocean, of the approaches to Batavia. These were things that competing powers would pay enormous sums, or commit significant crimes, to obtain. Van der Decken would have had them, the most accurate charts the Vok possessed, and he would have kept them in his cabin locked in a chest under his personal custody. If the Flying Dutchman is real, those charts are still there. 300 years of accumulated knowledge that nobody has been able to add to. 300 years during which the coastlines those charts describe have been surveyed and resurveyed, the soundings updated, the shoals charted more precisely than any 17th century instrument could manage. The charts in Van der Decken's cabin are maps of a world that no longer exists. Islands that have eroded, harbors that have silted up, currents that have shifted. The most accurate record in existence of what the Cape route looked like in the century when European maritime power was still being established. And he is still navigating by them. The third category is weapons, and this requires some context about what a Vok merchant vessel actually carried. The Flyet was not a warship, but it was not unarmed. The Vok operated in waters where piracy was a constant threat, where competing European navies might decide that a Dutch merchant ship was legitimate prize, and where the political situation in any given port could change between the time you left and the time you arrived. A Vok captain in the 17th century needed to be prepared for violence even if he was not looking for it. Van der Decken's cabin would have had a weapon rack. Pistols, the flintlock mechanism, was becoming standard in the mid-17th century, though matchlocks were still in use. A sword, almost certainly. Possibly a naval cutlass. Possibly something more personal. But the more interesting weapons in the context of the Flying Dutchman legend are the ship's guns. A flight might carry 8 to 20 cannon, depending on the period and the route. These were primarily defensive weapons intended to discourage attack rather than win pitched battles. And here is the thing about cannon on a ghost ship. In the sighting reports from the 18th and 19th centuries, and there are dozens of them, some from credible sources including Royal Navy officers, and at least one from the future King George V, who sighted the Dutchman as a young naval cadet. The ship is almost always described as still carrying its guns, ports open, cannon visible, a ghost ship that is still armed, which raises a question that the legend never answers. Who is she armed against? If Van der Decken and his crew are cursed to sail forever, if they cannot make port, cannot interact with the living world in any meaningful way, what is the point of the cannon? Unless the cannon are not for other ships. Unless they are for something else. Something that Van der Decken knows is out there in the waters around the Cape. Something that the rest of us do not have charts for. The cargo hold by the time the Dutchman appears in the legend is described differently in different accounts. Some say it is full the cargo Van der Decken was carrying when he made his fatal decision, now 3 centuries old and still in the hold because there is no port to deliver it to. Others say it is empty. Others say it is full of things that no 17th century Dutch merchant ship should have been carrying. Gold? Treasures from ports that did not exist on any Vogt route. The most interesting detail comes from an account in which the Dutchman's crew tries to deliver letters, the passing ship's letters, addressed to people who died decades or centuries before. Letters from Van der Decken himself, addressed to port authorities in Amsterdam, reporting a voyage that has never ended. Think about what that means. Even cursed, even trapped, even condemned to sail forever, Van der Decken is still trying to do his job, still trying to make port, still trying to deliver his cargo and his correspondence and complete the voyage that has consumed 340 years of whatever existence he has left. That is not a monster. That is a man who cannot stop being who he was, and whatever is in that cargo, hold whatever he has been carrying through 3 centuries of storms and calms, and the slow erosion of the world, he knew it is still there. Still logged, still documented in the papers on the table in his cabin, still waiting for a port that will accept it. Now we come to the detail that appears in the legend more consistently than almost any other, the compass. In nearly every version of the Flying Dutchman story that includes any description of the ship's interior, there is a compass. And the compass does not point north. Not because it is broken. It is not broken. The needle moves. It responds. It is alive in the way that a working compass is alive, responsive to forces that govern it. But the forces governing this compass are not magnetic north. They point somewhere else. Now, in the 17th century, compass variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north, which varies by location, was a known problem and a significant navigational challenge. Every competent navigator understood that his compass did not point to the geographic North Pole. He had to apply a correction factor that depended on where he was. Charts of the era included notes on local magnetic variation. Getting it wrong could put you miles off course. But Van der Decken's compass, in the legend, is not simply miscalibrated for magnetic variation. It is pointing to something that no standard navigational correction accounts for. Some versions of the story say it points to the location of Van der Decken's greatest regret. The moment when he could have turned back and did not. The exact coordinates of his sin, if we want to be theological about it. Others say it points to a place that does not appear on any chart. A harbor, a port, the destination he has been sailing toward for 3 centuries and has never reached. And here is what makes this detail historically resonant even outside the supernatural frame. The Vogt route around the Cape was, by the standards of 17th century navigation, extraordinarily demanding. The magnetic variation at the Cape was significant and variable. Ships that mishandled the compass correction ran onto rocks. Ships that understood it made the passage safely. A captain who had been rounding the Cape, or trying to round the Cape, for 340 years would understand the magnetic variation of those waters better than any navigator who had ever lived. He would have corrected and recorrected his compass against every sighting of every star on every clear night for 3 centuries. He would know those waters in a way that no map could capture, because maps get updated and he has been there since before the first accurate chart was drawn. The compass in Van der Decken's cabin is pointed at something, we do not know what. But it is pointed there with a certainty that 300 years of sailing in circles has only reinforced. Whatever is at the end of that bearing, he has been trying to reach it since 1680. And he has not given up. There is one more object in the cabin, and this one is not on any manifest. It is not in any historical inventory. It appears only in the most recent versions of the legend, the ones that have had 300 years of storytelling to develop into something more sophisticated than a cautionary tale about pride at sea. The mirror. Stern windows on a 17th century Dutch flight often included, in the more luxurious cabins, a looking glass. Not a modern mirror. Silvered glass was expensive and fragile on a ship. More likely a piece of polished metal, brass or bronze, mounted in a frame, functional rather than decorative. You needed to know what you looked like before you met port authorities or company officials. Appearance was a form of authority. But the mirror in the legend of the Flying Dutchman has acquired a property that no polished piece of brass should have. It does not show you Van der Decken's face. If you stand before it in the cabin of the Dutchman and in the legend, the crew of ships that have encountered the ghost vessel and sent men aboard have sometimes made it as far as the cabin. Though none of them have made it back, if you stand before it, it shows you something else. Some accounts say it shows you your own death. The manner and moment of it, clear as a portrait, inescapable. Others say it shows you the face of the person whose choices condemn them to their fate, not Decken. The face of the person looking into it. Your own decisions reflected back at you, stripped of the justifications you have built around them, which is the more terrifying interpretation. Because the mirror as oracle, the mirror as a device that shows you what is coming, is horror of a familiar kind. But the mirror as a device that shows you what you have already chosen, that strips away the story you tell yourself about your own actions and shows you the bare record, that is something different. That is something that has nothing supernatural about it at all. That is just clarity. Decken's cabin is, in the end, a portrait of a man who had everything he needed to succeed and chose failure instead. He had the instruments. He had the charts. He had the training. He had the experience. He had 200 men who trusted him with their lives, and he chose his pride over all of it. The logbook records it. The compass confirms it. The charts show the route he should have taken. The mirror, if you look into it, shows you the moment the choice was made, because the moment the choice was made is the moment everything stopped, and everything in that cabin is frozen at that moment, accumulating dust that never settles, dampened by sea air that never dries, waiting for a resolution that cannot come because the man who made the choice is still making it every night, every watch, every time the helmsman puts a hand on the wheel. Decken is not trapped on the ship. He is trapped in the decision, and the cabin is the evidence. Before we close the cabin door, let us talk about the sightings, because the sighting record for the Flying Dutchman is more substantial than most people realize, and it tells us something about the cabin and its contents that the legend alone cannot. The earliest documented sighting accounts come from the early 18th century, though oral tradition almost certainly puts the story earlier. The sightings continue through the 19th century with remarkable consistency, and the most credible accounts, the ones from trained maritime observers, from naval officers, from men who would have had every professional incentive to not report seeing a ghost ship, share certain details. The ship is seen near the Cape of Good Hope almost always. The waters around the southernmost tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet in perpetual conflict, are where the Dutchman appears. She is moving against the wind or against the current. Always, she is going somewhere. She has a heading and the light. This is the detail that appears in the most sober, most professionally observed accounts. The Flying Dutchman, in nearly every serious sighting report, is surrounded by a luminescence that contemporary observers described variously as fire, phosphorescence, or a glow that had no visible source. In modern terms, we might call this bioluminescence the natural light produced by certain marine organisms that can make the water around a ship glow under the right conditions. It is a real phenomenon. It is startling if you have not seen it before. It is the kind of thing that at night, in heavy weather, might make a ship that had already acquired legendary status look genuinely supernatural. But here is what is interesting about that detail in the context of the cabin. Bioluminescence is associated with particular water conditions. It is more common in certain seasons, in certain temperature ranges, in waters with particular concentrations of the organisms that produce it. The fact that the Dutchman consistently appears surrounded by this light suggests that she is consistently in the same waters, under the same conditions. She is not wandering the world's oceans. She is in the Cape waters. Her captain's compass is pointing somewhere specific, and whatever she is doing there, she is doing it with the regularity of a ship on a route. Decken is still rounding the Cape, or trying to. 340 years later, he is still on the same passage he could not complete in 1680. Still checking the same instruments, still consulting the same charts, still making the same calculations about wind angle and current and depth beneath the keel. The contents of the cabin, the logbook, the compass, the charts, the instruments are not relics of a dead voyage. They are operational. They are being used. Every night, in the waters around the Cape where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans argue about who owns the horizon, a man is bent over a navigation table working a problem that has no solution, because the problem is not navigational. The problem is the man. Pull back one more time. In 1680, or thereabouts, a man named Hendrik Decken commanded a Dutch East India Company vessel on the Cape route. He was trained, certified, experienced, and equipped. He had a ship built for efficiency, a crew trained for the work, and a route that hundreds of captains before him had completed without incident. And on a night when the weather turned bad, as the weather around the Cape always turns bad, he made a choice. Not a navigational error, not a miscalculation, a choice. He chose his will over the ocean's reality. He chose his schedule over his crew's safety. He chose to be the kind of man who does not turn back over the kind of man who brings his ship home. And the ocean, or God, or the devil, or whatever force governs the consequence of choices, took him at his word. You want to round the Cape? Fine, round it forever. The cabin of the Flying Dutchman is the most perfectly preserved crime scene in maritime history. Everything in it points to the same conclusion. The logbook with its last entry, the compass pointing at something that is not north, the charts of a world that has changed around them, the mirror that shows you your own choices. The logbook that stopped being updated the moment Decken stopped being the kind of man who learns from what he records. Every captain who has ever taken a ship to sea understands, on some level, what Decken chose and what it cost him. Because every captain knows that the sea does not negotiate. It does not care about your schedule, your cargo, your reputation, your pride. It is simply there, in whatever condition it happens to be in, and your job is to work with it, not against it. Decken decided to work against it, and 340 years later, he is still at the navigation table in that cabin, checking instruments that cannot tell him what he needs to know, consulting charts of a world that has moved on without him, writing in a log that has not been updated since the night he stopped listening to what the sea was telling him. The cabin door is still open, the lantern is still lit, and somewhere off the Cape of Good Hope, where the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean are having the same argument they have been having for 10 million years. A ship with no shadow is moving against the wind. She is still going. She will always be going. Because the man at the helm cannot stop, cannot admit he was wrong, cannot turn back. That is the real curse. Not God's punishment, not the devil's bargain, just a man and his choice, and the sea that never forgets what you decided when it was watching. The cabin has been empty of living men for 3.5 centuries, but it has never been empty.